Hello and welcome to the Westerville City Schools podcast, We Are the Ville. This podcast will take you behind the scenes of Westerville City Schools and show you the ins and outs of how our school operates and the great kids we have. I'm your host, Melanie Amato. In our last episode, we teased a little bit about our district's 200-year history and how all the students we educate came to be. We are Westerville City Schools, but our district boundaries go way outside the Westerville city limits. In this episode, we will focus on the two schools that started what we know today, and both of those schools are still in use. Please welcome back Chief Personnel and Policy Officer, Scott Reeves. Hello, Scott.
Hey, Melanie. Thanks for having me back, and I'm ready to get into this interesting story.
That's awesome. So, before we get into it, let's really go back to the history. Mm-hmm. Why do you think people should listen to the history of our district?
Well, first and foremost, I think it's an interesting story. One, it's a story of discovery. I've always used history as a way of answering the question, why? Why do we have the structure and makeup? And going back, I always enjoy discovering the answers to that. So, when you think back to us as a Westerville school district starting back in 1855 in literally a one-room log house cabin on Home Road on the north part of what is now Uptown, to growing to become the state's 11th largest school district with 14,500 kids over a very broad 52 square mile area. I mean, it's interesting. And we started off by a collection of a ton of one-room schoolhouses throughout townships that have consolidated. And Westerville is not unlike a lot of other areas. You have the same phenomenon happen with Worthington and Dublin and Hilliard and Gahanna and Groveport and on as those towns grew and gobbled up territories within the township to educate students that lived far beyond the boundaries of their villages and towns. And kids have come to our school from walking barefoot. I mean, we have class pictures of kids and half of them don't even have shoes. They came on their horses. They took lunch breaks with their horses to feed their horses and eat. They came in wagons. In fact, our first bus drivers drove wagons, not engines. And they packed kids in there for almost $1 a day. And kids came in bicycles. Eventually, kids came in trolley cars, believe it or not, right down the middle of State Street. We had trolley cars that connected us with the city of Columbus. And now they come in bicycles and cars and parent drop-offs and actual buses and my vans and all of that. And when you look at the development of our school district, it was made up from legislation. It was made up from Supreme Court decisions, not only the state Supreme Court, but the U.S. Supreme Court. And after having, and people don't realize that, we actually had over 2,000 kids taken from our school district. And most people don't realize that our remaining boundaries and today's boundaries, we really protected our past and our history and our heritage with what our school district boundaries look like today. So I just think it's a fascinating story and it's an enlightening story. And you'll hear names that you may have recognized, like Jim McCann, the iconic principal of Westerville North, the namesake of the football stadium. You'll hear names like former state representative and former governor John Kasich, who was instrumental in the boundaries that we have today. And so I think it's interesting. I think the point is helping parents and community members have a true understanding of why our boundaries are the way that they are. And when they do, they'll understand that the students they don't think should be ours have actually been ours all along.
And so I guess that brings me to my next question. I talked about in the last episode that the boundaries of Westerville have grown outside the city. We have the village of Minerva Park, the eastern portion of Sharon Township, the southern portion of Genoa Township, all of Glendon Township, and the far western portion of Plain Township. So are you saying that all the way from back when we served those kids right from the beginning?
Well, we eventually served all of those kids. When you go back to the very foundation of not only Westerville, but Ohio as a state, you go all the way back to 1787 and the development of the Northwest Territory, which was everything north and west of the Ohio River, which includes Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, Illinois, Wisconsin, that we won from the British in the Revolutionary War. Well, we had to govern it. And so they broke the territory into 6 mile by 6 mile townships. very English way of governing. And so as settlers start flooding into those areas, they had to have a way of managing government and services. And so they broke them into townships. Obviously, Westerville, its birth was in Blendon Township. One of the responsibilities of those townships was to educate kids. And most of them were done in either one-room schoolhouses in someone's house, in a church, in a barn, and it was very sporadic. And so that was really the birth of Westerville Schools. We were an outgrowth of Blendon Township having the requirement from our state to educate kids within the district.
So was Blendon Township then the first of how
Yes.
we became Westerville City Schools?
Nearly all the townships were the first school districts.
Okay.
Because the township trustees, and that was born from a law in Ohio around 1825. We had been a state for over 20 years at that point, but that was born from a law that said it was the township's responsibility to educate kids. And so they went around to all the sparse settlements and made sure that those happened. And the first school districts were really an outgrowth from those. The Westerveld family, which is the namesake of Westerville, was one of those settlements that began to grow and began to educate kids. And as I alluded to in the opening of our first episode, that once we built a log cabin specifically to educate kids, not in a barn, not in a house, not in a church, but in a log cabin specifically for that in 1855, that's what we count as our starting date for Westerville Schools. But we weren't alone. There were dozens of other singular schoolhouses throughout not only Blendon Township, Sharon Township to our west, Plain Township to our east, Genoa Township to our north. And some of those students were educated in those one-room schoolhouses. Some of those students rode their horse and rode their wagons to the Westerville area to be educated.
So, so they all started coming, I guess, if, those that would walk barefoot or come in buggy. So they all started to come to our one schoolhouse. How did we grow from there?
Well, I think once we established ourselves as a fundamental education facility, the very sparse church home, it was just easier to send their kids to our schoolhouse. And we actually outgrew our log cabin. It was built and ready for kids in 1855 by the Civil War, which started 5 years later. And through the end of the Civil War, we had outgrown that and had to build another school, actually. And it was called the Union School. And the Union School was built on Vine Street. And it was called the Union School because it was a union of not only Westerville students, but some of the outlying schools in Blendon Township that just kind of went defunct. And it was just easier to send the students there than continuing to parcel out one-room schoolhouses. And you had places around Blendon. You had Cherry Bottom. You had village schools. You had Central College, which a lot of people do not know that Westerville had a rival town next door called Almathea. Almathea is where Central College and Sunbury Road. It was a town that had a school district, Central College, within the auspices of Blendon Township. And really what made Almathea go defunct was the fact that the Pennsylvania Railroad decided to take their tracks through Westerville versus through Almathea, which they lobbied for to follow Big Walnut Creek. And once the commerce from the railroad came to Westerville, Almathea, there's still some remnants behind the bait and tackle shop. There's like a North Street and East Street. Those are Almathea streets.
Wow.
And so, but those students eventually would start coming to Westerville and the Union School, which was a little bit more sturdy than a log cabin.
Now, is the Union School still standing today on Vine Street?
No, it's not, actually. The Union School, we eventually outgrew that. And as Westerville began to grow as a town, what we know is the old Bag of Nails. People have been there. And on the third floor, maybe you've been to a gathering or an event on the third floor of the old Bag of Nails. Well, that was built in 1881. And at some point, it was City Hall. Well, we outgrew the Union School because more of these outlying Blendon Township areas began sending their kids to the Union School, and we had to overflow, much like we sometimes have to do at elementary here when we're overcrowded. We overflow to the top of the old bag of nails. And so eventually, even the Union School could not hold the students in the growing village of Westerville and some of the outlying areas within Blendon Township that were sending their students to the Union School.
And so how long did the Union School operate, and when did the village of Westerville decide, like, you know what, that we need something even bigger?
Yeah. And actually, that was not an easy sell. It took 2 or 3 times to convince the city, the citizens of the village of Westerville, to build a bigger school. And eventually, in the early 1890s, we were able to convince and pass a bond issue to build a school that very much looks like a castle. If you go around our state, you will see several buildings, school buildings built in the 1890s specifically, that look like castles around our state. For example, TMI, but my mom's from Urbana High School, and their high school opened in 1897, and it's called the Castle on the Hill, and it looks like a medieval castle. That was the kind of the architectural rage. Well, we opened what we call the Vine Street School, right next door to the Union School. Eventually, we changed the name of the Vine Street School, and today we know that school as Emerson. And that school still is in effect today. It opened in 1896 to a lot of fanfare. The governor of Ohio came as a part of the ribbon cutting ceremony. He came. The president of Ohio State University came, and obviously all the dignitaries from around the state. The interesting thing about the Vine Street School, it housed about 300 students, which was far more than was in the village of Westerville. So it was next door to the Union School. Today, if you stand on Vine Street and face Emerson, there's a house to the right that's white. That's where the Union School sat.
Okay.
Emerson was built right next door to it. And Emerson, when it was built, didn't have running water. We still were a well-water community, or getting water from Big Walnut Creek. Didn't have indoor plumbing, so there were outhouses out back. There was a barn next door for students who rode their horses. And didn't have electricity until 1914. So if it was a dark, cloudy, rainy day, you had to light candles or have gas lamps in there to light the schools. And so Emerson's come a long way.
And we still use it as a school today.
Yes, it was a sturdy building. They don't build them. You hear?
That's
they
right.
Don't build them like they built before, and they were. It was coal heated. In fact, the tracks of the coal car is still in the basement of Emerson. So it's a very unique building. It's a wonderful treasure, not only for our school district, but our community. But at that point, when students were already coming from outside of the village to the Union School, we had students from the one-room schoolhouses, some of the one-room schoolhouses that ceased to exist in Genoa Township, now starting to come and pay tuition. You had students on the far eastern portion of Sharon Township riding their horses or their wagon across the only bridge over Alum Creek, which today we call Main Street. And it was a covered bridge that students rode and came. So we were educating kids from the other side of Alum Creek in Sharon Township, the eastern part of Sharon Township. We were educating kids from the southern part of Genoa Township. And we had kids starting to come up from areas south of what was the village of Westerville. Today, give or take, right around the Schrock Road area, I would say, and a little bit part south of that, started to come to Emerson.
And Scott, I don't know if you know this, but while this is all happening up here in Westerville, what is the city of Columbus doing?
Well, the city of Columbus itself, it's the capital, so it's going to grow. It became the capital in 1812 and started to grow as the capital. And by the time we got to the Union School, you had some developments in Columbus that are very interesting. Right after the Union School opened, we opened some obscure school. The opening of it in Columbus was like on page 5 of the dispatch, maybe 3 lines. It said 5 or 6 students today started in the Ohio Agricultural Mechanical College, called it the Ag School. Today we know that school as the Ohio State University, and that started in 1870. They actually opened it around 1873 for kids. So there was growth in Columbus, growth in their schools. There's still remnants of schools from the 19th century in Columbus, but they are growing as well. But far, far beyond. When Ohio State was created, it was considered to be 4 miles north of the city.
So, and I guess that's where, we're going to get to at a point and somewhere in this podcast of almost how those boundaries start to cross.
Yes.
And the growth of both areas starting to take off and starting to merge, but still being different.
Yes. And the growth really, I think, really began to take off in the 1920s. And that was a significant decade, not just for the city of Columbus, but a significant decade for Westerville and a lot of other suburbs that were growing to move from villages to towns. The bigger ones were actually getting city designations. Westerville got city designation, I want to say in the 1970s. But you also had an elimination of a lot of the one-room schoolhouses around who began slowly just consolidating with the larger growing town within the township. And you see that a lot in the 1920s.
And that's where we're going to begin our next episode. So once again, Scott, thank you so much for joining us. And, we teased a little bit of what you're going to hear about next, but we need more growth, that we need to build another school. But where do we put it and why? Plus, what happens when people find out how great Emerson is and want to start coming here? What do? We build more schools. We'll get into that in the next episode. Thank you again for joining us, Scott.
Thank you, Melanie.